It began as a pre-dawn call for the police to a disturbance at an apartment complex in a Denver suburb on Sunday. It ended, officials said, in a fusillade of more than 100 rounds fired by a barricaded gunman who shot 5 law enforcement officers, killing one of them. The gunman was killed by officers. Killed in the attack was Zachary Parrish, a 29-year-old deputy who had worked for the Douglas County Sheriff's Office for 7 months, Sheriff Tony Spurlock said at a news conference on Sunday afternoon. He described Deputy Parrish as a smiley kid who was eager to serve. He is survived by a wife and 2 young children. Describing his meeting with the deputy's widow, the sheriff said, "When I sat with his wife and held her hand, I could see in her eyes that her life was over." 2 civilians, who the sheriff said appeared to have been in a neighboring apartment, were also shot. Their injuries were not life-threatening. A motorcade of law enforcement vehicles escorted a hearse carrying the deputy's body from the Littleton Adventist Hospital in Littleton, Colorado. Hours after the attack, numerous questions remained, including the gunman's motive, the type of weapon he used, what exactly happened leading up to the attack, and where the officers were positioned in relation to the suspect. The authorities on Sunday night identified the gunman as Matthew Reel, 37. Much remains unclear about Mr. Reel's life and his actions leading up to the shooting, but he did have an interest in guns. In June, he took an introductory course in carbine rifles run by a Colorado company called Kanaz Tactical Group, according to Robert Butler, the company's owner and lead instructor. "He was in our class," Mr. Butler said in a phone interview. "I'm kind of sick right now. Oh my God. We don't train people to do this." Mr. Butler said that Mr. Reel seemed like just the ordinary student, and did not seem unstable or violent. The course that Mr. Reel took is geared toward self-defense, Mr. Butler said. It covered the basics of rifle safety and taught students how to shoot and how to align their aim. Students were required to provide their own firearms. The gunfire shattered a quiet New Year's Eve morning at the Copper Canyon apartment complex, which describes itself on its website as having some of the friendliest apartments in Highlands Ranch, Colorado, which is about 15 miles south of Denver. The police were first called to the apartment where the shooting occurred around 3 a.m. on Sunday regarding a verbal disturbance, the sheriff's office said in a statement on Facebook Sunday night. That shifted some of the time elements from the sheriff's news conference. 2 men were in the apartment, and one said Mr. Reel was acting bizarre and might be having a mental breakdown, the statement said. Deputies left at 3:44 a.m., as no crime had occurred. Deputies were called back to the apartment by a neighbor at 5:14 a.m. about a disturbance, the sheriff said at the news conference. One of the men in the apartment, described by the sheriff as a roommate, had left before officers arrived, returned, and gave officers a key and permission to enter but left before the shooting, the statement said. As outlined by the sheriff, what happened next was murky. The officers were talking to Mr. Reel for about 30 minutes and at some point he barricaded himself in a bedroom. At 5:56 a.m., 4 officers were hit by rounds fired from the bedroom. 3 deputies were able to get to safety but Deputy Parrish was unable to retreat. The 3 wounded deputies could not immediately rescue him because of the amount of gunfire and their injuries, the statement said. Deputy Parrish was shot multiple times. The other officers, who were hit in areas uncovered by their protective vests, were in stable condition, the sheriff said. Officers with a SWAT team entered the apartment at about 7:30 a.m., and shots were exchanged between Mr. Reel and officers, resulting in his death, the statement said. An officer from the Castle Rock Police Department was also shot and injured at that time. The sheriff said Mr. Real was known to the authorities and had no criminal record, but would not elaborate. Sheriff Spurlock described what happened as almost an ambush type of attack and said the gunman fired very quickly with a rifle, though it was unclear what type. He knew we were there, and he knew we were coming, the sheriff said. He predicted a prolonged investigation that would draw on footage from body cameras worn by the officers. Family members of one of the wounded deputies, Jeff Pell, rushed from their homes in northern Colorado to the hospital after getting word he had been shot. Deputy Pell was in visible pain when his family saw him in the intensive care unit after he emerged from surgery, his sister, Shauna Jessen, said in a phone interview. Ms. Jessen said that he had been shot under the armpit and that the bullet had traveled down his torso to his hip. She said he was doing remarkably well after surgery. He comes from a law enforcement family. Deputy Pell's father, Joe, is the longtime sheriff of Boulder County, Colorado. Ms. Jessen said her brother had been in law enforcement for about 7 years, and had been looking forward to celebrating his 5th wedding anniversary on Tuesday. A resident of the apartment complex, Stephen Silknitter, rushed home from his weekend job as a truck driver when he heard about the shooting. He said he was trying to make his way past a police cordon when he heard what sounded like a fierce exchange of gunfire. 15 to 20 gunshots, he said. Return fire and then more fire. Mr. Silknitter, 50, described the apartment complex as a mix of families, couples, and older residents and said neither he nor his fiancée, Vera Cover, had ever felt unsafe there or knew any reports of violence. Highlands Ranch is one of the safest places in the Denver area, said Ms. Cover, 50. I cannot believe this happened in our backyard. Where do we go from here? Mr. Silknitter added. Where do you go without having to worry about being shot?